Today we're going to take a look at modern imperialism, but we're going to look at really in Asia, and we're going to look at kind of the success story of it with Japan, and then the kind of the falling stories of empires falling apart in China and the Ottoman Empire. Um, so the big thing to remember here is, why is Europe going through and conquering these different territories? And kind of the couple things to keep in mind is that, one, they're doing it for economic reasons. They are industrializing and they need new markets to sell all their goods to, and they need markets to bring in raw materials. So they're looking to open up new markets in China, which has been closed, in Japan, which has been closed, and the Ottoman Empire, which has been kind of a thorn in their side. So they're looking to sell things to these regions and also take resources from them if they can get them. Second thing is, it's all about nationalism. They want to show how great their country is, how powerful their country is. We want to show that their government's capable of doing it, and that the more territory they have and the better places they control, the better they are. And so they look better in the eyes of the rest of the Europeans. And then they're also doing it for religious reasons in some parts, whether it's going against the Islamic Empire and the Ottomans, or it's bringing China or bringing Christianity to new areas, which they try to do a little bit in China and Japan, but they just don't really accept that. So a little bit of a refresher here on that. And now we're going to jump into Japan, then we'll go to the Ottomans, then we'll look at the success story in the Japanese. So with China, we have the Qing dynasty ruling still. They're going to rule up until kind of the end of this time period here in 1911 or so. They're going to fall due to just weak government is the main thing. The Qing dynasty is slowly falling apart. The emperors are not doing a great job anymore. They haven't industrialized the country, and this is a major problem because they've had a huge population growth. They went from having 100 million people in 1685 to 430 million people in 1853. So in about 200 years, the population multiplied by more than 4 times. And without industrialization there, you don't have enough jobs, or without reforms to give people jobs, you have a lot of people sitting around doing nothing, getting frustrated, and it's just not good for the government or for business. Second thing, with the dynasty being weak, there's more corruption, less things are going to get done by the government. This will lead to more natural disasters, and it also leads to incidences like the Taiping Rebellion, which actually almost overthrew the dynasty. Taiping Rebellion was in southern China, as you can see kind of in the map there, and they started taking over different regions. And they were an interesting group in that they were Christians and wanted to bring some equality to women, but they also kind of didn't do that at the same time because, well, we're in history and it's a patriarchal society as usual. So they didn't really fix everything, and they had their own problems. They almost could have possibly overthrown the Qing dynasty, but they weren't able to line up with other rebel groups, which kept them weak. And so what eventually happens is the local lords of the region don't like this idea that Taiping's, or this new group, taking over, because they want to redistribute the lands and kind of fight for the common peasant. And the lords don't like this, the emperor doesn't like this, and also the Europeans that are trying to get access to these areas don't like this either. And so the Europeans support the lords, and the lords go and take out the rebels, and peace is brought back to China. Unfortunately, about 20 to 30 million people died, which is really bad on anyone's books. And so this sets China back, and it also sets the Qing dynasty back, because they now lose more power, because who solved the problem? The local lords did. So people are looking to the lords for help instead of the government, because the government's not able to do this. Now, the Qing did try to modernize, but there's just too much pressure from Europe. The Europeans wanted to trade with the Chinese, and they'd been doing this for a while, getting those luxury goods, but those luxury goods were making them lose silver and gold, and they didn't like that. And so they found out, really the British did, that you could sell them a drug called opium, which they were getting from India in the poppy fields, and it got the Chinese addicted to it, and you could make a lot of money off of it, and it was pretty cheap. And so even though it's kind of an immoral thing and not a good thing and something they didn't allow back home, they're like, well, we're going to get the Chinese hooked on this. So they start selling it to China over and over and over again, making thousands, millions, whatever, tons of money, making their money back that they were losing by buying all the luxury goods that they had in the past. And China's going, wait, this is not good. We don't want our people hooked on opium because then they just smoke it all day and don't get anything done. And we're now losing money to the British and Europeans, and so this again isn't good. And so they try to fight against the Europeans, but they don't have a modern military, and they just get the snot knocked out of them by the British both times. There were two opium wars, and they just it's not good for the Qing again. They lose more power. The emperor kind of becomes a puppet for just whatever the Europeans want to do there, and the Europeans start carving up those spheres of influence to control an area and be able to trade with it. Although the Qing emperor still kind of owns it or controls it, he doesn't really have a ton of power there. Now, the emperors did try to fix things and reforming the government, modernizing it by bringing in reforms to the government, by trying to bring in more industry, but the Europeans could sell their goods if they wanted goods much cheaper. The Europeans didn't want to set up businesses, and they had the capital. And the lords actually didn't want this either because they'd lose power because they have all the power right now. If they reform the government, more power is going to go to the peasants. They're going to have to be a little bit more democratic, maybe. And so they just don't like it and they fight against it. So there's very minimal modernization going on, which just really hampers China. And this could be seen within the Boxer Rebellion, where local Chinese start going in and attacking the Europeans. And as you can guess, the Europeans didn't really like this idea. And so the Europeans fight back and knock out the rebels, but then also lay down harsher demands on China and take more of a strong-fisted control of their regions. So China is not in good shape. They're going to limp on until 1911 or so, when the emperor will finally be overthrown for a nationalistic government, and then there will be World War II in there that will kind of mess things up in China, especially in Manchuria, where Japan really hits hard. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about Japan. But they'll have this nationalistic government that's somewhat democratic, but then that will fall apart, and the communists will come in power in the 1940s, and that will kind of bring an end to the dynasties and now have the modern government of the Chinese Communist Party running China. Now, next on the list is the Ottoman Empire. We'd seen them come to power when they defeated the Byzantines and set up kind of an Islamic version of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they were doing a pretty good job, but they had kind of lost their modernization, just as kind of China did. They had let things fall behind, and then noticed that, oh crap, Europe is ahead of us, and now we got to try to fix this. But it was kind of too little, too late. The Europeans came in and took away their territories either by leading revolutions in regions like Greece and the Balkans over in Southeast Europe, or by actually going in and taking it over, like Napoleon did in Egypt, which then became a free area and then got taken over by the British, and other areas like Libya. And so the Ottomans are really just left with Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and then the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia and those areas. Even Saudi Arabia is a little bit, or not, it would be modern-day Saudi Arabia, but it's even kind of lost. They don't have full control there. So they're falling apart, and with that, when the more they lose in territories, the less revenue they have. The less revenue they have, the less the government can do, and the less effective it is. So it's not good for them. On top of this, they have corruption issues within the Janissaries and other areas of government that are causing problems, and so this has really weakened the Ottomans. And they will try to bounce back here, and they do a better job than the Chinese do, but it still doesn't help them catch up to where the Europeans are. Selim III tries to reform the military to get things better, but that fails. He actually gets assassinated or brought in and killed later on by Janissaries because he tries to reform that. Then there's another reform called the Tanzimat, This is the one that actually kind of works well, and this is one to remember. Um, it makes the government more secular, which means there's a separation between what would be Islam and the government. There isn't it's not an exactly Islamic government. It's not a religious government anymore. Um, it also makes all men equal, no matter where you're from, what religion you follow. It makes everyone equal. It also brought a little bit more equality to women, and they attempted to industrialize the country and eliminate some of the corruption going on. And now they're somewhat successful in this, but at the same time, the Europeans, just like they did in China, kind of keep industrialization to a minimum because they can sell goods a lot cheaper than the Turks can, and or the Ottomans can, and um, they don't make it a good warming or a good environment for the Ottomans to industrialize. They kind of undermine that so that they keep their power um, in the region. And then the last group here that tries to fix it is the Young Turks, and they come after the Tanzimat. They keep fighting for new rights. They want it to be more democratic, and slowly over time it actually becomes a little bit more like that, and it leads to a rise in Turkic nationalism, which is why Turkey is its own country now, united by that. That starts here. But that also leads to nationalism in Arabia and other Middle Eastern areas for their specific ethnic group. So that's going to lead to problems. It's a good thing for the Ottomans at the time, but it's also going to cause a bad thing in that it'll lead to the dividing up the empire, people wanting to break away from the empire, and it will also kind of lead them into World War I, when nationalistic fervor throughout Europe is a big thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the good thing with all this is there are new rights for people. They are trying to kind of reform the government. The government gets better. They just can't compete with what the Europeans can do industrialization-wise. And so they get better. They do better than Chinese, but they can't equal what the Europeans can. Okay? And then the last one, Japan. Japan we haven't talked a whole heck of a lot about recently, but we're going to do kind of like a little crash course here, going through some history to the Tokugawa period, which was before this, and then we're going to look at kind of the more modern Japan with the Meiji Restoration. Japan is an island nation. If we go back to our map here, Japan's the island nation. You can see it right over here if you look at the cursor. It's also very mountainous, and it's a bunch of islands, so it's very hard to control. And so the daimyos, or what we call the lords in kind of similar to Europe, have a lot of control over their specific region they have. And this makes the emperor weak. And so they needed someone to step up and try to unite all of China, and that's what the Tokugawa clan does. They united all of China under what they would call the shogun, who pretty much ran China, but the emperor was still at the head, and the emperor is kind of a descendant of the sun goddess. So he's in control, but he's really not in control. The shogun runs the show. And this works for a good couple hundred years. This is when the Japanese kicked the Europeans out with the trade and the Christians and all the things that the Europeans were trying to do early on in the imperialistic age. They kicked them out. And this brings peace when the shogun takes over, and it brings economic prosperity and also urbanization. Which is great, but it's also going to lead to the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate, because it's going to lead to corruption, because there isn't a challenge to the government. It's going to lead to different classes rising up from their status. At the top, if you look here, we didn't talk about this yet, but if you look over here on the right-hand side, you got the emperor at the top of this. And it looks very similar to the medieval feudal system. You got the emperor at the top, then you have the daimyos. The shogun is above there is the top daimyo. And then you got those daimyos. Then you got the samurai warriors, which are kind of similar to the knights in Europe. And they were supposed to be these great warriors. Over time in the Tokugawa period, they become more bureaucratic administrators. But this is a very honorable position to be in. However, peasants, artisans, and merchants who are lower than them are starting to make more money with this urbanization. They're able to get more from their crops, or they're getting goods that they're able to now trade between the different cities and make a lot more money on than they were before. And so some samurai are saying, well, I can be in this honorable position, but I could also drop out and become a merchant and be a lot wealthier and better off. So I'm going to go with that option. And so this leads to kind of the fall of the Tokugawa period. On top of this, the Europeans and the U.S. still want to have a say in what's going on, or want to be able to trade with Japan and do all that stuff. And so the U.S. comes in with Admiral Perry saying you need to open up your ports, and the Tokugawa, under kind of threat of gun, say okay, we'll do that, and then that will lead to their fall because Japan's honor is taken away by this, and other treaties that come from other European powers that jump on after the U.S. does this, and so they're not happy with what's going on, and so we have something called the Meiji Restoration, which is where a group of samurai put the emperor kind of back in power, although he doesn't really have full power. These samurai help run the government, actually run everything pretty well, and they get rid of the Tokugawa shogun, and they modernize Japan. They get rid of the whole feudal system. They get rid of it. No more samurai, no more daimyos or anything like that. Everything is controlled by the government that is set up, that has the emperor at the head. And they start changing also kind of values. They go from being very Confucianist, which they will still keep, but going more towards Shintoism, which is more of a religious belief in spirits and things like that, which melds more with their new philosophy on what they're going for. They will also send a lot of people, government officials, students, to go and study cultures abroad, and they will also bring some of those cultures in the West, or governments in the West, and how the civilization works. And they will also bring some of them in. For example, the Japanese will study under the greatest land-based army at the time with the Germans, or the Prussians, I should say, and they also learn from the best navy at the time with the British. And they're doing everything they can to become the best modern country they can. Along with this, they became more democratic, allowing people to vote for the government and having a parliamentary style government like what Britain has. And this government that's set up leads this industrial revolution, which is kind of different from what we've seen in other industrial revolutions, where it's led by the businesses. The government actually steps up and says, we need to industrialize, and so they establish businesses or corporations called zaibatsus, which then they will, after succeeding, they will then sell to private investors. And this brings the government a lot of money. It helps really revitalize or build up the economy, and the Japan's restored, and it's now able to rival the European powers. And on top of this, ladies, you actually gain some rights, or you gain an education, although this education is separate from men, and you don't gain political rights really. But it's a step up from where women were at in Japan before. Okay, and the last part here is Japan then takes that next step. They rival the British, they rival the French, they rival all those European powers. They will actually beat out the Russians in a war for Korea, and they will become an imperial power. They will take over Korea after defeating those Russians in the Sino-Japanese or Sino-Russian War, Sino-Russian War, or Russo-Japanese War. Sino would be China. Sorry, the Russo-Japanese War, where they will win it and get Korea as a colony. They'll also take Taiwan over, and they will also gain a sphere of influence in Manchuria, which is kind of the main area of where the Qing dynasty is. So this undermines the Qing dynasty. They will also, with this sphere of influence, eventually take it over completely in World War II and really devastate the area. We'll talk about that more when we get there, but it's not good, and it's why, if you pay attention to the modern news, Japan and China have a lot of hostilities towards each other, and it really stems from this time period here. Big thing with these colonies they set up, though, they don't act any different from the West. If anything, they act like the West, or more Western than the West does. In some areas, they're more cruel, like what I just brought up with Manchuria. So it's not a great deal, although people will look up to them in other colonized nations or nations that want their freedom or that want to be like them. Um, they they don't treat anyone else better. They don't say, "Oh, well, we didn't like how we were being treated, so we're not going to treat people that way." They go, "We're going to be just like the Europeans and do everything we can to get everything out of these colonies that we get." And so um, they do that, and this will lead us into kind of the modern period of Japan rising, becoming a major superpower, Europe on the top of its game, China falling, the Ottoman Empire falling, and um, we're going to see that this is all going to culminate in a couple world wars here at the start of the 19th or 1900s, the 20th century, and it's going to really reshape the world that we live in today.